Morning to you.
Good morning.
What is your message to those nearly 900 people arrested over there?
They're people of principle and they're people of courage, and they are appalled that civil disobedience should become an act of terrorism. And I was just a few minutes ago looking at a speech, an excellent speech, made by Shabana Mahmood in 2014, of supporting people who opposed the then bombing of Gaza. So I think we need to think about the legislation that's being passed. Protest should be allowed in our country. And indeed, when I, for example, challenged Jack Straw on this in the Terrorism Act 2000, I said, will this criminalise civil protest? He said, no, never.
It's interesting you cite a speech, which I haven't read, obviously, but Shabana Mahmood speaking up against, in the interest of protests against a situation in Gaza, because there's a difference, of course, towards doing that and supporting a proscribed terrorist organisation. John Healey, the Defence Secretary, said yesterday to Trevor Phillips, I would say to those people, voice your concerns, protest on the streets, challenge us as a government to do what we can to relieve the suffering in Gaza, but that does not need to be linked with support for Palestine Action. It's a fair point, isn't it?
Not really, because Palestine Action have been prescribed by the government, and I personally oppose that legislation because I do think in a free democratic society there should be a right to protest. When they went onto the base at Brize Norton, they knew what they were doing. They knew that they would be charged with criminal damage. They knew they'd be charged with criminal trespass. They took that risk. They knew that, but they did it out of principle. They were not involved in bombing anybody. They weren't involved in killing anybody. They weren't involved in threatening anybody's safety. And instead, they've now become a terrorist organisation and threatened with very long terms of imprisonment. I understand their case is not going to get to court until January 27.
But I mean, you can disagree with the fact that Palestine Action has been prescribed, but there have been. I mean, you're a parliamentarian. You can lobby the government to try and change that position, even if it one day proves to be the wrong decision, until or if the decision gets changed. It is illegal.
All those that protested on Saturday knew that, but they wanted to make their case, their point, that they think this law is wrong, and they're protesting against it, knowing they're taking a risk in doing so. Isn't that the great tradition of our country, that people do protest? Suffragettes protested, the Chartists protested. There are
but it wasn't illegal.
Yes, it was illegal. It was illegal to support people in many occasions, and those trade unionists that defied industrial relations legislation in the 1970s.
OK, but then I feel like...
But the point of protest in our society.
Yes, but there's also a terrorist organisation that has been prescribed. I mean, I don't want to try and sensationalise things, but what if someone marched in protest in support of Hamas? I'm sure you would condemn that.
They're not going to do that, are they? Because the people that protested on Saturday were protesting about proscribing an organisation that itself was dedicated to civil disobedience, not terrorism.
But they broke the law. I mean, again, I can quote the Home Secretary yesterday, the Defence Secretary yesterday, who said of Palestine Action, they've been responsible for criminal damage, they've been planning other acts of similar violence, and it was those steps that, advised by the security agencies and the police, that the Joint Terrorism Analysis Unit made the decision to prescribe them. I mean, it's quite a different step. You could still protest the situation in Gaza, as, by the way, you did Thursday, Friday last week with your gathering, in a peaceful way, and land your argument in a way that will bring people along with you.
Look, people went to Parliament Square to protest, as they've done in the past. And many of them were actually very elderly people, including lawyers, vicars, teachers, nurses, doctors, a whole range of people. Surely the government should think for a moment, if this whole range of people are prepared to face a criminal sanction for supporting the right of another organisation to protest that has since been sanctioned by the government as a terrorist organisation, maybe they should just think for a moment, perhaps this prescription of Palestine Action was just a step too far.
And again, I urge people to watch the entire conversation that Trevor had yesterday with John Healey, where he raises that very legitimate question. But just to round this part off...
Phillips raised that question,
yes. Yes, that's what I meant, if I misquoted it. To round this part off, just really interested in your take here. It sounds to me like you are encouraging people, or certainly applauding them for taking this step, which is essentially applauding them for breaking the law, but you're not doing it yourself on an issue you care about. So how do we square those two things? If this is the right course of action of people to protest the broader issue, despite the legitimate points from the Defence Secretary of the nuance that you could do it in another way, why aren't you doing it yourself?
I'm at lots of protests, and I'll carry on being at lots of protests. Look, let's look.
But you encourage people to break the law.
No, I said I respected them for going there. I respected their principles. I know quite a lot of the people that are there, constituents of mine. They're people of deep moral conviction and principle. Can't we just accept that there are people of deep moral conviction who are not prepared to see fellow citizens made into terrorists because they protested against the bombardment of children in Gaza? Can't the government think for a moment, maybe they've just got it wrong on this legislation?
But you won't go that far yourself.
Let's see what happens.
Let's talk about the reshuffle, if we may. Are you surprised that the next leader of the Labour Party won't be Deputy Prime Minister?
It is, well, they could be, I suppose, couldn't they? We don't know who the next deputy leader is going to be.
You mean if David Lammy runs and wins?
Well, I don't know who the deputy leader is going to be. I don't even know who's going to run. They might even manage to concoct a situation where there is no election and they get a sufficient number of nominations to corral off anybody else from standing in the Parliamentary Labour Party. I honestly not sure I can help you there.
Your old friend and colleague Emily Thornberry saying yesterday she's considering it. Do you think she should run for the deputy leadership?
That's up to her, but I think the Labour Party needs to think very carefully about what it's achieved in the past year in government, like continuing with the two-child benefit cap, like the taking away the winter fuel allowance, then reinstating it, and like the continued attack on personal independence payments for people with disability. There's some really bad news they've done in the past 12 months. They haven't done much to redistribute wealth. They haven't done much to empower people. And indeed, the public cynicism of this government is pretty deep.
I mean, some people are stepping back from the reshuffle to ask the question as to whether it will mean a renewed attempt to reform welfare payments, a renewed attempt for a harder line on small boats policy, and possibly to water down the Employment Rights Bill. What's your take on that?
I suspect they may well be right on that. The endless discussion about small boats and refugees, rather than looking at the human issues of people involved in that, the people who are the victims of that, is actually empowering Nigel Farage on the far right in our society. Surely the government is capable of making the moral case for dealing with asylum seekers by recognising them as human beings in a desperate situation. They're not doing that. Instead, they're trying to criminalise people because they've crossed the channel.
What would be your policy, your new party's policy on the small boats issue?
I think what we want to do is have agreements across Europe on looking at the source of people seeking asylum and ensure that they don't have to undertake these horrendous journeys and can make applications elsewhere. The numbers of people actually arriving are much smaller than the number of people that actually leave Afghanistan in the first place. But I do think we also need to look at, they're not all from Afghanistan, of course, but those that from Afghanistan have often even worked for the British Army. Their families have been fingered by both the Taliban, the warlords, and they're in a very dangerous and desperate situation. We have some responsibility in this. We, after all, were involved in the Afghan war for 10 years. 20 years.
I would say that, approaching a conciliatory deal with various European countries is broadly what the government has tried to do. And clearly, maybe it will work. It hasn't worked yet. Because 30,000 have crossed this year. It's the fastest pace that milestone's been reached. And I guess, to your point, maybe there are much higher numbers coming into Europe as a whole, but 30,000 is still a lot. Is your point that we have to take our fair share and it might be more than 30,000?
Well, you have to make sure that all the European countries sign up to it. I used to be a member of the Council of Europe in the last Parliament, and we discussed this at great length in Europe with parliamentarians from all over Europe. It's not the EU, this is Council of Europe, which is separate. We discussed all this at great length. And the problem is that there's a rise of far-right populism across Europe and in this country with Farage. And too many politicians are just frightened of this and not prepared to stand up for it and not prepared to stand up for the European Convention on Human Rights or indeed a sensible and fair policy towards refugees. Why are we demonising refugees, putting them in hotels with virtually no money, waiting around for a very long time for a decision? These are often people that have great skills that we actually need in our society. We have, 300,000 vacancies in the care sector. We have many more vacancies within the National Health Service. We have people ready and able to work.
I mean, those two particular sectors, though, obviously require very clear qualifications under British law. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I doubt of the 30,000 that have come in this year, as you said, I'm sure many of them, if not all of them, are very skilled and could work if possible. But I doubt they're doctors.
No, they're not. Unlikely that very many, if any of them, would be doctors, but many would be well able to undertake care work, for example, and to train and qualify. Why don't we, instead of sending people to do nothing in hotels for a long time, think about them to get their cases processed quickly, and if they win the case and meritorious of staying, allow them to train and work. We need skilled workers in this country. We have a labour shortage in almost every industry.
Jeremy Corbyn, good to see you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us.